I call this meeting to order. Welcome to number 6, the 16th meeting of the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. We are meeting today to continue our study on the inclusion of Indigenous languages on federal election ballots. For the first hour,
witnesses again today joining us virtually. The first panel will include Jean-François Daoust, Assistant Professor, University of Edinburgh, Dwight Newman, Professor of Law and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Rights in Constitutional and International Law, University of Saskatchewan, and Alison Harrell, Professor, Political Science Department, Université du Québec à Montréal. So on behalf of PROC committee members, I would like to welcome you all with us here today, and we will get right into it. So up to 5 minutes for your opening comments, starting with Mr. Daoust.
All right, thanks a lot. Merci. Donc, je me suis unmute. Je suppose qu'on m'entend bien.
I'm hoping you hear me well. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning to everyone. When I became aware of the subject of today's discussion, I saw 3 distinct parts. The first part requires us to think about the principles and values of our society that would have us either include or not include Indigenous languages on federal election ballots. This is a fundamental and so-called normative discussion that involves value. The second part concerns technical concerns. How could this be applied and work in practice? The third and final part of concerns the implications and the potential consequences based on what we know from empirical studies on Indigenous electoral participation. I will focus on the first and third parts, the normative aspect and then the empirical aspect from the literature, setting aside the technical consideration. With respect to the normative aspect, we need to think about our society's values. What are they and how can they be reflected in public policy? Clearly, Canadian society wants to be inclusive. At the political level and regarding the electoral process, this implies aiming to include all groups in society so that as many people as possible can participate. This means paying special attention to those groups that participate less in democratic life. In many ways, we need to look at groups that systematically participate less. And in that regard, it makes sense to allow Indigenous people to vote with instructions in their own language included on the ballot in 2022. The Indigenous people face systematic barriers that make them less likely than non-Indigenous people to participate in the democratic life of Canada. So it looks like a good idea to be able to allow them to participate in their own language. And that is the reason that I think that we need to think in a sympathetic way for the sake of inclusiveness. Now, the empirical aspect. And I think the considerations are the following. Can we expect to see higher Indigenous voter turnout as a result of these initiatives? My short answer is probably not, and if yes, it would be very limited. And why would that be? Because we should expect to see higher voter turnout only if this makes it easier for Indigenous voters to vote, and if this consideration, that is how easy it is to vote, has a significant impact on the decision whether or not to vote. However, the research, while limited in terms of Indigenous data, makes it very clear that the vast majority of people consider that voting is either very easy or fairly easy. And furthermore, ease of voting is not one of the most important factors which would influence the citizens to either vote or not. In other words, difficulty with voting is not one of the reasons why non-voters do not vote. To sum up, I think that at the normative level, and given the value that Canadian society places on inclusiveness, when it comes to Indigenous people, I see no reason not to include Indigenous language on ballots. However, at the empirical level, my reading of the literature is that we should not expect significantly higher voter turnout because the reasons for not voting lie elsewhere than in the ease of voting. And this initiative does not focus on those factors, such as Indigenous interest in politics. That said, I base my conclusions on the current data and research, which is very limited, and it would be essential to produce further research papers, such as those produced by Fournier and Lowen in 2011, or by Alice Harrell and colleagues in 2009. There you have it. That is those are my initial remarks.
Thank you so much. Merci pour vos commentaires.
Thank you very much for your comments. And for the interpretation, I would ask everyone to speak a little bit slower so that everyone is able to follow in the language of their choice. So that's a lot of information, and it's very much appreciated. We now have Professor Newman, 5 minutes.
Good morning, honourable members. I'm Dwight Newman, and I work as Professor of Law and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Rights in Constitutional and International Law at the University of Saskatchewan. I appear today as an individual. Proposals to add Indigenous languages to election ballots in Canada have circulated in recent years. There's a new imperative to thinking on these matters insofar as Canada adopted last year the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or UNDRIPA, which received royal assent on June 21st, 2021. Amongst its provisions, Section 5 of that act establishes a statutory requirement of the government taking all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the declaration. That's a far-reaching statutory obligation, and it bears on many topic matters that are seldom discussed. Article 13.2 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has a clause requiring that states take effective measures to ensure that Indigenous peoples can understand and be understood in political, legal, and administrative proceedings, where necessary through the provision of interpretation or by other appropriate means. That clause of that article has received very little attention in the UNDRIP scholarship, but it represents an important commitment concerning participatory rights of Indigenous peoples, partly because Article 13.2 establishes rights for Indigenous peoples as collective entities, though, rather than pertaining to individuals, Article 13.2 probably does not mandate any specific requirement of ballots being available to individual Indigenous voters in Indigenous languages. However, the adoption of such a practice would certainly be in accord with underlying objectives of the UNDRIP. The enhancement of Indigenous participation in democratic decision-making accords with the declaration and represents good policy in a democratic state meant to have full involvement of all voters. Sections 3 and 5 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, protecting the right to vote and rights against discrimination, may well offer stronger legal arguments against impediments to voting. As with other barriers that Elections Canada has worked to overcome, there are arguments for it to overcome linguistic barriers, particularly in the case of individuals who use other languages and have limited proficiency in English and French. In some ways, Canada is behind on these issues, notably as compared to the United States. I would draw the committee's attention to the 1975 amendments to the US Voting Rights Act that added Section 203 that established various forms of language assistance in districts where that was needed for minority language communities. So that's decades back that the US has done this. There have been challenges at times on implementation, which has not always been smooth, but there's been a statutory commitment there in US legislation. In the context, though, of Indigenous peoples, the US has had some ongoing challenges. Here I would draw the committee's attention to the March 2022 report of the Interagency Steering Group on Native American Voting Rights, which has just reported to the White House and has examined a range of factors affecting Indigenous participation in elections. There is discussion of language factors, but there are a wide range of other factors that need to be taken into account, which raises questions about what are going to be the most effective means of enhancing Indigenous participation in elections. In terms of the language issues at hand, there are a number of key questions to consider that I know this committee has already been discussing in some ways, of whether Nunavut is a special case, where there's a particularly strong argument, what population cutoffs might bear on whether it works to provide translation of ballots in a particular riding. Issues concerning what particular form of Indigenous languages might be used on ballots, whether in the form of syllabics or in transliterated forms in the context of languages that have both versions. Other issues concerning the costs generally and whether those costs might be more optimally invested in other ways of supporting Indigenous electoral participation. There are many things we could talk about. I'll just say there are also many options the committee could consider in terms of most effective ways of advancing Indigenous electoral participation in cautious ways. The use of sample or facsimile ballots is an option rather than changing the main ballot. Other forms of language assistance are possible. And the committee could also think about something like a pilot program in the context of Nunavut that would test things out in one riding before making Elections Canada try things out across the country all at once. So I'll stop there and just say there are big questions about bridging principle, the aims of legislation, and what legislation can and will achieve in practical ways. And it's wonderful to see the committee working to live up to commitments of supporting Indigenous electoral participation, and important to do that right.
Thank you, Professor Newman. And now to Professor Harrell, 5 minutes to you. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be here, Madam Chair. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling from the unceded territories of the Kanakahage Nation, on whose land the Université du Québec à Montréal is located. I'd also like to situate my comments. I speak for myself as a specialist in the study of electoral democracy, and I'm particularly interested in my own research in how various groups and people can build a more inclusive democracy. So my remarks this morning will be focused on what research in this area tells us. I'd like to raise 3 issues that are worth considering when thinking about the inclusion of Indigenous languages on ballots. First, I think it's important to think about this issue from the perspective of barriers to political participation. We actually know quite a bit, and my colleagues have mentioned it on the committee this morning, about the reasons that people do not engage in federal elections in this country. In a past study that I conducted with Demetrius Panagos and Scott Matthews in 2009 for Elections Canada, we showed that, as we have seen across many countries and contexts, socioeconomic resources are an important barrier to all electors, and this is true as well for Indigenous people's participation in electoral politics. Yet we've also shown the importance of trust in the federal government and the salience of Indigenous issues as mobilizing, especially for young Indigenous electors. And here I think is where our findings are important for the current discussion before the committee. The presence of Indigenous languages on ballots is an important symbolic gesture to indicate that Canada is interested in the participation of Indigenous peoples in the electoral process, and that their voices are important, and that we want to make sure that they're included in that conversation. Indigenous peoples were, as you know, one of the last groups in Canada to have restrictions on their voting rights removed in 1960, and historically have participated in federal elections at lower and some of the lowest levels, though this varies across individual elections as well as across Indigenous nations. It's important to note that participating in elections is a choice, and while it is important for free and fair elections to remove barriers to participation, many Indigenous people and nations choose not to participate in Canadian elections. So I'm not speaking on behalf of these communities in any way, but I think it is important to recognize that Canada's colonial history means that we need to ensure Indigenous people can participate on their own terms in our electoral processes, while acknowledging that some may not see the electoral process as either legitimate or their own. Making ballots multilingual could be a step to increase the legitimacy of the electoral process for these electors, and perceptions of legitimacy not only support broader participation, but are also important for the health of our democratic system. So this brings me to my second point. As the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada pointed out to this committee on March 29th of this year, the diversity of languages, the complexity of the production timelines and translations, and the current regulatory framework make putting in place multilingual ballots a challenge. I don't want to discount the organizational challenges that implementing this change would create, but I would like to point out that the presence of a ballot in one's own language can have multiple benefits. There are symbolic benefits. The importance of recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples, cultures, and languages to exist and be included cannot be understated. There's also a benefit of access for Indigenous peoples to participate in their language of choice. For Indigenous electors who speak a language other than English or French and prefer to speak a language other than English and French French only ballots can create an unfair barrier to participation. And I think there's also a benefit towards reconciliation. If we're serious about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, then beyond the symbolic and access benefits to Indigenous peoples themselves, we need to make a strong statement as settlers that Indigenous nations are on equal footing with English and French in this country. Which brings me to my final point. I'm not an Indigenous person. I'm a settler on these lands. I think the key issue for considering Indigenous languages on ballots should be whether Indigenous nations and electors want them in order to fully participate in the electoral process. While there may be costs and challenges in implementing multilingual ballots, I think reconciliation requires a serious commitment on our part to make accessible the electoral process to Indigenous electors in their own language. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today, and I'm glad to be taking part in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will now get into 6-minute rounds, starting with Mrs. Mrs. Block, followed by Mr. Turnbull. My apologies. Mr. Turnbull, puis Madame Goudreau, and then Ms. Idlout. Mrs. Block.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And through you, I would like to welcome our witnesses to our meeting, and thank you very much for being here, joining us, and providing us with your testimony. My questions are I'm going to start with directing my questions through the chair to Professor Newman. Welcome, Mr. Newman. It's good to see you joining us from Saskatchewan. We have heard in previous testimony, or it has been suggested in previous testimony, that Canada is under a legal obligation to include Indigenous languages on federal ballots. But in your comments, you stated that there was no such obligation set out in UNDRIP. Is there any other legislation, to your knowledge, that would make such a requirement?
Well, the strongest argument, in my view, would come from the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the possibility of an argument there that there's an impediment to the right to vote and or non-discrimination rights. If there were a successful argument along those lines, and I'm not aware of any case law that's gone that direction, it would probably bear not just on Indigenous languages, but on other minority languages in ridings that have populations that are similarly situated in some respects in speaking another language and not having proficiency in English or French at the highest of levels, and thus facing a barrier. Beyond that, I wouldn't be aware of other legislation. There would be some who might make an argument around Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, but I don't think it can easily apply to a federal election process as opposed to providing general rights concerning maintenance of Indigenous languages.
Thank you very much. You also mentioned that UNDRIP establishes rights for Indigenous people as collective entities rather than as individuals. Can you explain that differentiation and the impact that it does have on Indigenous individuals in the political process?
Sure. So UNDRIP in some of its articles uses a terminology of Indigenous peoples having certain rights. In other articles, it uses a terminology of Indigenous individuals having certain rights, or certain rights are held by peoples and individuals. In the context of Article 13.2 on political proceedings or legal and administrative proceedings, the reference is to Indigenous peoples. So a natural reading of the language there would end up suggesting that it's concerning the opportunity of peoples through their representatives to participate in political processes or legal processes. So if there's a duty to consult issue where representatives of an Indigenous people are concerned, they would certainly have rights that arise due to 13.2, but it doesn't necessarily imply rights for individual Indigenous voters in the context, say, of an election process, even while there may be sound policy arguments for that and welcome reasons for that in light of broader values. But I don't take the view that there's a specific legal right that would arise there.
Thank you very much. Perhaps maybe my last question, I don't know how much time I have. You did touch upon facsimiles of ballots. And so my question would be, would facsimiles of ballots in Indigenous languages provided in voting booths be an alternative, which would also be in the spirit of UNDRIP as it is currently set out?
Well, looking at some of the literature on the United States, they use the term sample ballots, and they're somewhat the same idea as a facsimile ballot that I think Elections Canada talks about. Insofar as that removes a barrier, it could be an effective way of removing a barrier and meet the legal concerns that would arise there, as well as some of the policy concerns. Obviously, there's a different symbolic connotation to that, and the committee would need to weigh that, and those engaged with this issue need to weigh that over time. But there are challenges with changing the ballots themselves in terms of accessibility for others. A crowded ballot raises issues for access by persons with certain disabilities. And so there are complex choices to be made, I guess, is what I would say. And if there can be effective ways of surmounting barriers while avoiding problems, that's probably always good policy.
Thank you. 1 minute left. Okay, final question. Are you aware of any other jurisdictions that are either addressing this issue after adopting UNDRIP or looking at including Indigenous languages on their ballots?
I'm not aware at the present time of others that have made specific moves on this issue after UNDRIP. There may be some of which I'm unaware. As I mentioned, the United States, even since 1975, has made some efforts around this issue, although in the state of Alaska, there had to be litigation around this, and there were complexities confronted, partly because of issues of multiple dialects of languages and how those would be used in different parts of a constituency, or whether all of those would somehow appear. There's some challenging questions there, but the United States has made these efforts for decades, and I'm not an expert on the American context. It would be worthwhile drawing significantly upon some of that experience and finding out more about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that exchange. We will now go to Mr. Turnbull, 6 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to all our witnesses for being here today. I'm really finding this discussion rich. I know we're just beginning today's discussion, but we've been building, I think, meeting over meeting, a really good in-depth analysis of this important issue. And certainly our last meeting revealed testimony that I think was really impactful on me. All of the meetings, I would say, have done that. But maybe I'll start with Mr. Newman. First with you, I'm sort of interested in picking up on the theme of UNDRIP. And as you said, UNDRIP received royal assent in the Parliament of Canada in June 2021. And I note that we often say that UNDRIP now has to be implemented. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, Professor Newman, if you could, and I know you've spoken to this already in some of your opening remarks, but are there any other articles within UNDRIP that obligate the government to respond, I think, to this very important issue of Indigenous languages being included on ballots? I know you've already mentioned Article 13.2, and I have that in front of me here, and I find that really relevant. But I also have looked at Articles 1, 9, and 15, and wonder if you have any comments on any of the other articles within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So I'll throw it to you first. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm just pulling up my copy of UNDRIP if we're getting into further articles of it. And I'll say that there are, I'll say first of all, with respect to the commitment on what's sometimes called implementation, Canada has passed a particular statute that has two key obligations in it, one concerning an action plan to pursue the objectives of the declaration. The other part is a commitment to seek consistency of Canada's laws with the provisions of the declaration. And those are two key commitments. In respect of other articles of UNDRIP, they may shed light on the broader objectives of it. Certainly Article 1 is with respect to general provisions of international human rights law. If your suggestion is that gives rise to an obligation in respect of Indigenous languages in voting, it would be in the context of that obligation potentially arising with respect to other language communities as well. Article 9 concerns rights to belong to an Indigenous community or nation and wouldn't bear directly on federal election processes, in my view. Article 15 concerning general provisions on the cultural rights and dignity of Indigenous peoples, again, sheds light on the objectives of the declaration, as all the articles should be read together. But again, it wouldn't bear as specifically on something like a federal election process. Article 13.2 is the one that is, in my view, closest to the issue, although, as I've suggested, in some ways the reading gives rise to limited consequences in specific terms, even while the broader objectives of Indigenous participation in decision-making would call for good policy that promotes Indigenous languages in this context.
Thank you for that detailed response. I do appreciate it. And perhaps we can go deeper into that discussion. But I do also want to pick up on a theme that Ms. Block brought up, which was something you mentioned, Mr. Newman, in your opening remarks, was about the other jurisdictions. And specifically in the United States, you had said that Canada seems to be a little bit behind compared with them. I'm just sort of interested whether there's any other jurisdictions around the world where we can use, or learn from in terms of a model on this. And if they've used kind of a phased approach to this, because what I've heard, certainly we've heard contrasting views that from Elections Canada, there's significant operational challenges. I think, some of those probably need to be overcome, and I think we're in a position here to give some direction. So I'm interested to note how maybe other jurisdictions have overcome some of the challenges, and maybe how they've done so over years or decades. So if you could provide, actually, I would maybe go to Mr. Newman first, and then maybe ask the other panelists if they would like to weigh in. Thanks.
The others may have more to add on some of the other jurisdictions. The most natural comparators for Canada on Indigenous issues would be jurisdictions like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, in terms of some shared political practices combined with some features concerning the nature of the colonial experience and sort of the proportions of the population and so on. And I understand Elections Canada is in some discussions with the Australian context. They would be better prepared, I imagine, to shed light on that. I looked mainly at some of the scholarship on the United States, which, as I say, has been much more active than Canada in some respects on this issue. And someone going back to the history of 1975 could look into how it was that they managed to make the adjustment so quickly versus what one hears about the challenges that Elections Canada thinks they would face. But the others may have more to add on other jurisdictions.
Want to hear from?
I'd be happy to hear from the other panelists if they had any remarks, and I know that my time is up, Madam Chair, so I'll leave it at that, and just maybe others.
Maybe if I can just allow a quick 30 seconds to the other two panelists, starting with you.
Unfortunately, I am not knowledgeable enough beyond the Canadian case and the UK, but I assume that New Zealand and Australia, as mentioned, would be the cases to go for.
May I also intervene, Madam Chair?
Yes.
So, and I guess I won't add any additional to what Mr. Newman brought up, except to say during the COVID pandemic, the jurisdictions at the provincial and federal level experimented on rather quickly with a number of alternative voting options. And so one other additional option to explore was the use of special ballots. And I think we learned a lot over the last 18 months about the ways in which those can be used effectively to help voters have access who won't be able to vote on election day.
Thank you for that addition. Madame Goudreau, 6 minutes pour vous.
Madame Goudreau, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to our guests. I would like to simply say publicly that I want to wish you a happy birthday for Madam Chair. Yesterday was your birthday, so thank you once again, dear witnesses. So I really did appreciate Professor Daou's intervention, and I would like to ask him, he was talking about the principles and values, because from the beginning we've been talking about technical things and there are different solutions that have been proposed. But when I hear that about what we can do to favor inclusion, because honestly, what I've noted is that we all have good intentions, but we especially would like to avoid having, and I'm sure that my NDP colleague would be in agreement. I think that we don't want to do something that would be simply symbolic. So I would like to have Professor Daou tell us what we should expect if we move ahead with this initiative for the next elections, and what type of impact would we see on inclusion when we think about truth and reconciliation. Should I answer, Madam Chair? Yes, okay. I'm sorry. I didn't want to go ahead, but yes, I think thank you for your question. I think it's important when we talk about symbols, we seem to think that it's something that's minor and it's not important, whether it be that it's symbolic rather than substantial. But symbols do have impacts that will affect other political attitudes. And this is something that was mentioned. There's questions of trust with respect to the federal government that can help favor participation in elections. And it could have a direct effect of making the vote more accessible and reducing costs. So but it might have a limited direct impact. But however, if that measure would affect other considerations, for example, the fact that the Indigenous peoples can better trust their government, and that they may have an increased interest for politics, and there could be more of a substantial impact. I don't think, though, that we should expect any kind of important impact, as I said in my opening remarks, because even within the samples that we have, Indigenous people feel that it is easy to vote. And so I don't know that it's going to necessarily facilitate voting, since it's already simple for them. So I think the impact would be limited. However, symbolically, I think it would be especially symbolic, but I think that could have important impacts. The question, so that brings me, I don't know if Madam Chair, if our witness has had the opportunity to hear the testimony of other preceding witnesses, but that's what I'm wondering. We're going to be establishing just how much all of this is going to cost. We have an intention here. We have a noble gesture before us. So all of this can be done, will be done, hopefully, in respecting all of the Indigenous communities. And we have heard in our former witnesses that what can we do to be able to help people be interested in participating in democracy. We have heard we have a colonial past, And we need to be able to accept that, to name it, and to be able to act. So maybe Madame through you, Madam Chair, maybe she could answer. Madame Harrell. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question and the opportunity to answer. I think that we shouldn't say that the Indigenous peoples aren't interested in participating in the democratic process, but it's just in this certain types of participation. But they do have their own political activities where they do participate. So the question is, how can we help them participate in the Canadian political activities? And so I think that when we're talking, I think Jean-François Daoust was speaking about important impacts. It's an indication. These changes would mean that we're interested in what they can bring and that we're interested in them. I do agree with Mr. Daoust that on the short term, I don't think that we're probably going to see any enormous increase in political activity. But I think in terms of long-term inclusions within the Canadian state, I do think that it can have positive long-term effects and that they may be more participatory. Question, thank you. The witnesses mentioned this is a first step, but that there needs to be a continuity of action to be able to include Indigenous peoples. That means investments, that means going further with respect to legislation and changes so that we can see positive changes to their participation. So I think I'm almost running out of time. Professor Newman, through you, Madam Chair, I did appreciate the idea of the pilot project. We can make a major change, but we can also open a small window and do a pilot project and then change after that. Thank you very much, Madame Goudreau, and thank you also for your birthday wishes. Ms. Idlock, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin asking my first questions, I want to first say thank you for providing an interpreter for me because I'm able to speak in my language. I want you to envision every one of you, all the voters, if you were able to read and write in syllabics, in Inuktitut languages, you would understand what I'm saying. I am really, really thankful that I'm able to speak in my own language. The first question I want to ask is to Jean-François Daoust. In your research, have you conducted studies on the impact of colonialism on Indigenous engagement in politics?
Tout est beau au niveau de la traduction?
Une minute, oui, il n'y a pas de traduction anglais. Est-ce que ça fonctionne maintenant?
I can switch to English.
No.
The point of this conversation is that people can use their languages. So the English interpreter was on the wrong channel. Are you able to hear? Is this working now, the translation? Okay, well, we'll continue then. So I haven't done any direct research on colonialism, but I did look at a study that was recently published with where you saw the effect for all Indigenous peoples, the possibility of being able to vote for an Indigenous person within their riding did have a positive effect. So as to the effects of colonialism, that doesn't really answer your question necessarily, but it was there. We did see a positive effect. Otherwise, I'm not sure what you're thinking in terms of research, but no, I have not published any such research.
Thank you. I also want to ask, have you made accumulative piles, or have you compiled the results of your researches pertaining to Elections Canada? Can you please share with? Can you please tell me if there's any such recording of the studies you've done?
Résultat, si je les
Whether my findings have been published, and I have data from Elections Canada. I can send you references. There's the Canadian Journal of Political Science that has published one of the articles and on Elections Canada. And so, yes, it was recorded. It was published, in fact.
When you have collected your research, your collective research, have you consulted with Indigenous peoples about what they think about Elections Canada? Thank you. Sorry.
Have you collected data on the extent of Indigenous employment in elections offices?
L'emploi
for the employment of Indigenous peoples within the ridings. We haven't done any interviews with Indigenous peoples to ask them what they think about voting and Elections Canada. What we did was we studied the data. So this is really an empirical data type study. So with respect to employment with Elections Canada, from memory, but I might be wrong, I think there are what's called empiric controls, control variables, where we look at the average age of people within a riding, we look at their revenue, and probably other measures.
Sinangin na makay katuksoy si mga pitu kasi nasutuin na tiyak tunga kasyurang mga ta no nakakak si mayut ikanayakti.
First, I am not sure if I was clear in my question. I just wanted to ask if you have collected data on how many Indigenous people were employed by Elections Canada.
No.
No, unfortunately, we did not look into that type of data.
Lastly, I want to ask you, have you collected data have you found in your studies whether Indigenous voters have increased, or has there been any significant difference in the number of Indigenous voters when there's a federal election? Thank you.
Well, in terms of you're talking about the number of people voting. You're not talking about the number of candidates. So, no, we did not look to see with respect to the number of voters, the electors. No, we haven't noted any kind of increase. We didn't study that. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you for that exchange. We're going to now do the next round, and I kind of saw a hint that we could do this. Usually I go through the whole second round, but we're actually going to do one from each party for the second round. So it'll be 5 minutes to Mr. Stanley, followed by 5 minutes to Mrs. Sahota, followed by 2.5 minutes to Madame Goudreau, and 2.5 minutes to Ms. Idlout, and to the clerk. We'll then switch over to the second panel. Mr. Stanley, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the witnesses that have brought forward their testimony today. I did notice a couple common themes on a few of the presentations, so I'll ask Mr. Daoust and then Mr. Newman a couple of questions where there were similarities in their presentations. One thing that you both said was that language may not be one of the biggest issues with voter turnout for Indigenous people across the country. And I think that comes with the idea that they're a little less trusting of government sometimes, and people really do have some issues around their ability to vote. One issue was the social economic resources are a barrier, and a few other issues. So in this study that we're doing right now on languages, could you just pull out a couple of the other biggest issues you see right now as allowing for more participation from Indigenous people across our country, other than having a language on that ballot? What would be the two biggest issues both of you see in trying to have larger participation from our Indigenous people across the country? So Mr. Daoust first, and then Mr. Newman, please.
Okay. Sorry. So I missed the first part of the question because I was lost in translation. But I picked up the very last bit. Yeah. So the cost of voting or accessibility to vote is not the most important factor predicting whether someone is going to vote or not, and this is true for both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. You mentioned two most important factors. I would say, at least from the latest study that I recently published, it's political interest, which can be linked to trust, although it is quite distinct. Political interest and having a sense that that voting is a duty and not a choice or a right. And of course, this is quite normatively loaded. The word duty and the conception of voting as a duty. So it raises serious questions for that, and especially for Indigenous communities. But I would say these two factors: political interest and voting as a duty.
Thank you very much. Mr. Newman, do you have something to add to that?
Well, one thing that I'll add is the importance of reaching out to Indigenous communities across the country to hear from them what the different barriers are. And when I referenced the report of the Interagency Steering Group on Native American Voting Rights in the United States, that's one of the things that they did. And the situation of different Indigenous communities in different parts of Canada is very different. And the reasons that may stand in the way of voting are going to vary a lot as between those different Indigenous communities. And you may hear that in Nunavut, the language issue is very important. There may be other issues that are significant elsewhere, and I would agree with those that have been raised. I would agree with Professor Harrell's comment earlier that in certain specific places, there are Indigenous nations that don't regard the Canadian state as legitimate, and thus don't participate in election processes. That's a different factor all in its own category, in a sense. But general issues around just having policies that reach out to Indigenous communities. And I hope that all parties will be continuing to develop policies that support the futures of Indigenous people in Canada, the economic opportunities that they need. And I think voter interest will be enhanced when Indigenous people see all parties coming forward with good policies that advance their opportunities in life.
Thank you very much, Mr. Newman. And the trust factor, I think, actually falls at all of us that are politicians around this table and reaching out and making sure that we do build that trust with different groups across the country. So that's something I heard loud and clear from both of you as well. I am very interested in the U.S. 1975 amendments that happened in a few jurisdictions around language assistance. And is that something where we could look at doing not reinventing the wheel, but is there proof that this language assistance program since 1975 in certain jurisdictions has improved voter turnout among Native Americans in America? So not to reinvent the wheel, but is there any documentation that this language assistance program has benefited voter turnout? And Dr. Who made that comment? It was Dr. Newman. Is there any proof that that does help out, and could we replicate something like that program?
So I haven't looked at the empirical literature on the results of that across the United States. There hopefully would be scholars who have, and it would be worth looking for their scholarship on the effects of that, because there have been various writing or the equivalent of writings designated based on over 5% of the population with Indigenous languages and other languages, Asian American languages, Latino American languages, etc. And so it would be worth looking at that data and what the effects have been for various language communities.
Thank you very much. That's my time.
Thank you. Mrs. Sahota, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you to the witnesses, I'd like to first ask Professor Harrell, maybe if she could comment on some of the questions that were raised in Professor Newman's opening remarks. There were a lot of questions, I feel more questions raised than answers as to how this committee should recommend going about moving in this direction regarding whether we should or should not just present these ballots in places where there are already territorial elections happening in this way, whether we go beyond that, whether we provide proportional cutoffs or thresholds, as some may call it, depending on the population. If there's more than one language that is predominantly used, how many languages do we put on the ballot? So if there's syllabics used, or should syllabics also be introduced? So I was wondering if Ms. Harrell can comment a little bit and help us understand as to what we should really be recommending to Elections Canada, because I think there's a lot of will to try to move in this direction and do better. And I know that you had mentioned in your opening remarks that we should be doing whatever Indigenous communities would like us to do. So to Mrs. Harrell. Professor Harrell.
Thank you for that. So I think I would start by saying that to reiterate a point that Professor Newman made, consulting with the communities that are concerned seems like to be of the utmost importance to find out what they think are feasible solutions to be able to get languages on the ballot. That being said, I think the operational challenges are important, and I think I said that in my opening remarks as well. And so one of the things that I think is important to think about in doing that is that I wouldn't suggest taking baby steps, but a pilot project going with something that seems operational feasible, at least in the short term, makes a lot of sense on my end. And I'll tell you why. I think going all in and having it be a disaster is worse than doing it step by step in a process to build on capacity for doing this, because a really failed experiment, I think, could actually have larger consequences for people's trust in the system than a sort of step-by-step process of getting these in place in a way that's feasible and makes it actually not a problem when an elector shows up at a voting booth to vote.
What, in your opinion, would be the best way to consult with Indigenous communities on this? Do you feel that this does the witness feel that this committee should be doing that work and consulting communities, or does the professor think that maybe some type of in-house council within Elections Canada or an outside advisory group or something of that sort should be undertaken?
Professor Newman may have some things to add to this, but I think building capacity within Elections Canada makes a lot of sense. And to have that, I think in every step of the way, consultation is probably a good thing, but building in-house capacity within Elections Canada to explore options with people that are reaching out to the communities makes a lot of sense to me.
Do any of the other panelists have anything to add?
I just say all of the above are valuable, and there may be limits on how many of them can be done. But any engagement by the committee, by other designated individuals on behalf of the committee, by Elections Canada developing its capacity, all of those would be valuable.
How much more time do I have, Madam Chair?
You have 1 minute, but I think Mr. Dell would also like to add.
Please go ahead.
Just said fully agree. And the first part was about when, probably as soon as possible, but otherwise fully agree with what has been said.
Madam Chair, in the previous committee meeting, we had Ms. Idlout also mention that rather than looking at thresholds of population or language use, we should be doing this from a different perspective of maybe where languages are dying out. Wondering if any of the panelists have the comments to make about that.
We'll just do a quick round robin. Perhaps we can start with Professor Newman, followed by Professor Harrell, and then to Mr. Dowd, and that will bring us to time. Professor Newman.
I'll just say it depends very much on what the objectives are. If the objectives are to enhance electoral participation or opportunities for electoral participation, it makes most sense to work with situations where languages are in active use and in fact in use in place of English and French. Where languages are dying out, there are very important policy objectives to undertake to support the survival and revitalization of Indigenous languages. I'm not sure election ballots would be the first policy step that is most fruitful on those matters. I can understand the sentiment, but I would say it's far more important, in my view, to invest in other supports for those languages in terms of survival and revitalization.
And I concur with Professor Newman.
Fully agree.
Well, that is absolutely excellent to see a little bit of consensus forming amongst witnesses. Thank you for that great exchange. Madame Goudreau, 2 minutes et demie pour vous.
Merci. Madame Goudreau, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. I have a question because when we talk about investment and that we have to follow our words with our action. Well, we do need to do something, and so with this initiative that we have here, we see that we're opening up, and we want to go further with inclusion. My question, it's very simple. Madam Chair, this week we heard. Witnesses from the Northwest Territories or Nunavut, we saw that there was a photo, the image of the candidate. So I would like to ask each witness the following question, and maybe you don't have an answer, but why, with our legislation, why do we not have any photos, and what do you think? Given the diversity of dialect and the question of the facsimile and all the other issues, I would like to hear each one of you on that issue. Photos.
Monsieur Daoust.
Mr. Daoust, go ahead. You go first. Well, I think that it opens the door to different unfortunate consequences. We know that people use cues and shortcuts when they're voting. In some elections that are maybe less important, in municipal elections, simply the order of the candidates through alphabetical orders, that could have an effect on the election. So to have images that could open the door to unfortunate consequences. This is not my final opinion on the matter, but that's the first thing I think about when we come to that question. Madame Harel. Well, I think that we need to look for creative solutions. So if photos and several languages come together, I think that that would be like logos, images of parties. I think that we could imagine possible inclusions on the ballot where we don't have to have the translation into 5 or 6 languages. So I think I think Mr. Doe's concerns are appropriate, but I think that if the photos weren't very good, it could have an impact on the vote. But I do think we need to look at it. Do we have time to hear Mr. Newman on this? I agree with the others. I think we need to look for creative solutions, and this could possibly be one creative solution. But we also do need to take into consideration effects that were unexpected effects and other things that might occur, such as what Mr. Doe has suggested. Thank you, Mr. Newman. Your French is excellent. So thank you very much for this exchange. And we're going to take Madame Idlut, you have 2.5 minutes.
Chairperson, I've spoken with the interpreter and informed her that I'll be asking all my questions in English. And with your discretion, I will be asking a series. I have 7 questions that I would like to ask Professor Newman. You've already answered my first question, which was, are you bilingual? And I've now heard that you are. So my next question is, how often do you vote in federal elections?
Well, I vote in each federal election that takes place, unless I've missed one along the way. I can't say that for sure, but generally speaking, I've attempted to.
Thank you. Has there ever been any procedural reasons you are not able to vote?
I've faced issues around location at times if I was traveling or was located overseas at the time of some elections. And that's where I say I'm not certain if I voted in every one for which I was eligible. So I welcome that Elections Canada takes steps on those issues of accessibility when people are away from their ridings.
During those times when you've had to, what was the information provided to you in all languages that you understand?
It was, and indeed that would be something to highlight in terms of the concerns that could arise, not necessarily in terms of information on the ballot, but the availability of information in other contexts. I, of course, benefit from being in locations where I easily access the internet. I know very well that in Nunavut, there are concerns around internet access in some communities at times, or at least concerning bandwidth speed. But that's an issue in some other parts of the country as well. And Elections Canada needs to try to make information available in all pertinent ways.
Thank you so much. Do you feel that your language rights are adequately protected?
Well, as an English-speaking person, I don't have any difficulty with language rights of my own.
Do you think that Indigenous people deserve the same language rights protections that the English and the French-speaking Canadians receive?
I think that there indeed should be protections for Indigenous language rights, whether they would be identical to English and French in a country where those are the two official languages and used by much larger numbers of people presents some issues, and especially considering the large number of Indigenous languages. But the protection of Indigenous languages raises very important rights issues and should receive a great deal of attention, especially given the cultural significance to Indigenous peoples of their languages.
Thank you. What obligations does the Indigenous Languages Act give to the Government of Canada?
It's a while since I've been looking at all of the parts of it, so I wouldn't be placed to set out all of the obligations from that act today.
Okay, my last question is, as a form of reconciliation, is it not time that we turn empathy into action?
I would totally agree that we need action urgently on various issues concerning Indigenous peoples in Canada. and empathy goes only so far. There needs to be real action on a lot of different issues, and that needs to be in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples across the country who are in a variety of different circumstances on different issues. And that's a straightforward point to say that we need action on various Indigenous issues in thoughtful ways that work well for everybody, but that are responsive to all Indigenous rights, obviously.
Well, I thank you both for that exchange, and I will just state that I am a chair who tries to have comments go through the chair because it's challenging for interpreters to translate. And I think as we have these conversations on language, I know you had 2.5 minutes. We provided you with 4 minutes and 22 seconds because this is important that we have these exchanges. But in future, I would just be mindful of our guests who come to join us with information and just, we're not in a traditional courtroom. So I just say that. And I would like to thank our witnesses for your thoughtful comments. If there is anything else you would like our committee to consider, please do not hesitate to provide it in writing to us. But I really want to say that it was quite informative. And I hope you keep well and safe. I hope the sun shines more often in April than not. And we look forward to continuing this important work, all of us together. So with that, we'll be switching over to the second panel, and we'll take a 30-second pause so we can test mics. Thank you. Members back to the second panel. for today, and we're continuing the study on Indigenous languages on ballots. I would like to welcome Marjolaine Chernish, General Manager, and First Nations Education Council Denis Gros-Louis, Director General, to our committee. We will start with 5-minute opening comments, or up to 5 minutes, and we will start with Ms. Chernish. Welcome.
Oui. Tu peux regarder nos questions derrière. Dans ma langue, je salue toutes les...
In my language, I'd like to say welcome to everyone. Well, thank you to all of you for your invitation. That it tells me the importance of dialogue for the benefit of the greatest number. I am Innu from Washatmak, Manitoulin, on the north coast of Quebec. I am Executive Director of Institute Chekapesh, which is an organization that's been working for the last 45 years for the promotion of our language. So I think that the members of the Innu First Nations need to be able to experience their citizenship fully, have access to documentation, and to have access to ballot in their own language and to be served in their own language. This is important to give the right to be able to be heard and recognize the nation, both with their language, culture, and their identity. It is now time to go beyond simple tokenism and to officially take concrete action by seeing them as an important political role, having an important political role to play. Participating in the development of a legislative framework, in this case in the federal election ballots, is a step forward. Many Indigenous peoples do not see themselves in Canada's current democratic process. They feel excluded and therefore powerless. And so to express their resistance, they abstain from voting in federal or provincial elections, or by refusing to participate in the Statistics Canada census. All of this has enormous consequences for our communities, especially in terms of socioeconomic conditions. The Indigenous peoples have greatly contributed to Canada's development over the millennia and continue to do so today. I will end this section by saying that I've only scratched the surface on this. Now I'd like to discuss the importance of being able to use one's own mother tongue. This one's permanent and fundamental characteristics of an individual development is their identity. This identity and its pillars are based on the ability to speak one's own language and one's own culture. Using one's language helps us form a vision of the world and our sense of belonging to a nation. And most importantly, it defines who we are, where we come from. Indigenous peoples have formed a close relationship with and have great respect for nature, including all living things. This is our way of life. Respect is one of our fundamental values, and this needs to be reciprocal. According to the Public Inquiry Commission on Relations between Indigenous People and Certain Public Services, residential schools have had a long list of enormous intergenerational impacts. I think you are sufficiently aware of the consequences and of the threatened disappearance of Indigenous languages and the profound changes that this has had for our communities. Of course, we cannot make everything black and white, but the many consequences suffered by First Nations are important. Cohesion in a democracy requires all nations to be included. The First Nations and Inuit members, and their numbers have been growing. This demographic rate represents hope for the future of young people, providing they feel welcome in a democracy. Accessibility to various government structures is possible if everyone is taken into account. The Government of Canada has at its disposal all of the reports of the Royal Commission on Indigenous Peoples and the Hawthorne-Tremblay Commission, to name but two, to re-establish genuine, healthy, respectful relationships. First Nations have the right to participate in the development of Canadian society, to access to its development, and to have access to the same benefits enjoyed by all Canadian citizens. All the strategies, recommendations, and concrete solutions are outlined in these studies. It takes political will to create a fair and just society for all. Thank you for listening. Thank you to you for your comments. And now we will hear Mr. Denis Gros-Louis.
I will need 7 minutes if you allow me. So, bonjour, wagon de Jadi. Mon nom est Denis.
My name is Denis Gros-Louis. In my language, it means the person who works for freedom. I'm participating today from the unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat Nation in Quebec. I would also like to thank the First Nations Educational Council and the Member of Parliament for La Prairie, Mr. Alain Terrier, for this invitation. I would also like to thank Monsieur Terrien from La Prairie and all of you who are here today studying an important subject. The First Nations Educational Council is an education that brings together 8 of the 11 nations in Quebec in the field of education: the Abenaki, the Anishinaabe, the Atikamekw, the Huron-Wendat, the Pequot-Malicot, the First Nation Wolastolik, the Mi'kmaq, and the Kaninkaha. The Assembly of First Nations Quebec-Labrador has delegated to the FNEC the mandate to testify before your commission. I also had the approval of the Chiefs Committee on Education to present the issues that are specific to Quebec. Our organization also has the mandate to host and support the coordination of the Regional Committee on Heritage Languages. I hope that the elements and recommendations that I'm about to provide will be useful to you in your study of allowing the translation of federal election ballots into Aboriginal languages. The study you are doing is a good first step to respect our languages, and I see it as an action that promotes reconciliation. In Quebec, there are 11 Aboriginal languages, and some have dialects. There are different levels of vitality in their communities. Some are in a state of dormancy, and others are spoken fluently and are the language in use. Many elders in our communities are monolingual, and they only speak their language. And when they leave their community, they become strangers in their own country. Our languages are the vehicle for expressing our worldview, the thread that connects the past to the future. In short, they are the cornerstone of our identity. However, the link between identity and First Nations participation in federal elections is much more complex, as my colleague Marjolaine has said. To paint a quick picture, but realistic and frank, I must also point out that perspectives are polarized in nations and communities on the issue of the First Nations vote. There are nations that are participating in this exercise and other nations that are refusing to participate. Indeed, recent data from Statistic Canada shows that the most recurring reasons for not voting for Aboriginal people is political. A refusal based on reasons that sometimes go back to the very existence of Canadian Confederation. And of course, the Indian Act, which has not had a positive effect on our nations. Whether it is because they are asserting their sovereignty or because they do not feel respected and involved in the issues, there are many reasons why First Nations voters are disengaged. Overall, the question of identity is at the center of the reflection that you must study in order to positively act on the participation of First Nations in Quebec. An Elections Canada study on the evolution of First Nations voter turnout shows that communities in Quebec have the lowest turnout in federal elections, 27.8%, almost 34 points lower than the national cumulative average. Who is on the ballot? What issues are presented, and how they are presented certainly have a great deal to do with the interest and participation in the electoral process. In other words, solutions and initiatives will have to go beyond translating ballots into our languages to show respect for our languages, our culture, and a sincere focus on reconciliation in a concrete fashion. The translation of ballots into Aboriginal languages is a good action valuing linguistics, and by valuing language, we change the way we see the world. And it will help us participate, because to marginalize the language is to marginalize the culture and the visions of the First Nations. You might observe what has been gone before the courts. And we've seen that the government machines and the positions that have been taken through the courts have meant that there have been programs that do not help the federal policy, because these policies are flouting modern treaties. It was shown that last week it was said that it was expensive to translate. Well, we feel that to say that it's expensive, we don't think that that respects our communities. And I would like to say that respect and redress for the damages that have been done is priceless. As a former Aboriginal Affairs election official, I can tell you that the policies are a matter of honor and responsibility. To increase participation, having access to a democratic right was given back to us only a few decades ago, and it is priceless. I spoke about identity and language maintenance, and in Quebec, we are in a situation where we have one language. We are witnessing the colonialist approach of the provincial government in its updating of the Charter of the French language, which are efforts that are undermining and demoting the use and the maintenance of our languages. And worse, it flouts modern treaties. Many of our members do not distinguish between levels of government. People don't necessarily see or understand these differences. So our recommendations, we have 4. In response to the call to action number 57 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it would be important to provide sensitivity training to Elections Canada's senior management and staff, focusing on the history of Aboriginal peoples and, more importantly, cross-cultural competency. Second recommendation, to establish a consultative and collaborative relationship between Elections Canada and the Office of the Aboriginal Languages Commissioner, who is the watchdog for Aboriginal languages in the federal public service. Third recommendation, as proposed in the Assembly of First Nations report on the First Nations voter participation, in order to work towards improving voter turnout in Quebec, Elections Canada should ensure that voter information is not simply on the ballot, but in a document that we worked on in Atimidik that would go above and beyond the vote, where it would speak to the process for unilingual voters so that they understand the vote, a guide to the federal election. And this should be offered in all the 11 languages of the nations in Quebec. Also, it would be important to ensure that the images presented in the booklets reflect the identity of the nations. Thank you. Thank you very much.
With Mr. Viss, followed by Ms. O'Connell, puis Madame Goudreau, and then Ms. Idlout. 6 minutes to you, Mr. Viss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make sure I get the pronunciation correct here. Tishernish? Is that correct, Madam? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Oui, très bien, merci.
Okay, thank you. Have the Innu people of northern Quebec signed or are in the process of working on a reconciliation agreement with either the government of Quebec or the government of Canada?
Pas à ma connaissance.
Not to my knowledge.
To Mr. Louis, Gros Louis, are any of the nations you are representing today are in the process of signing a modern treaty or reconciliation agreement with the government of Canada or the government of Quebec?
The 8 nations that are represented by our council is involved in reconciling in an education agreement framework that hopefully will be forthcoming, recognizing our language will be part of the education value added of the agreement.
Do any of those nations plan on making a recommendation that would incorporate some of the points you made today regarding Elections Canada and the process of Indigenous participation in federal elections? To your knowledge? Through you, Madam Chair?
There's some sound issues. To my knowledge, we are going to work on safeguarding, protecting, enhancing, defending the rights of our language, whether it's with the at the federal and or provincial level. What we're interested in is to value all the efforts we're doing to work with our youth to grow in our education programs with pride. And when there are barriers such as not understanding the ballot and having to support elders to read the ballots, what you're proposing in your studies will be a value and a step forward. In terms of going beyond that in terms of a comprehensive modern treaty is beyond my mandate today, and it's not at the core of what we prepared for.
Thank you, and I understand. Of the youth at the Education Council, of the youth that you represent, how many can fluently speak their Indigenous language? Or how many are in the process of learning that language as part of their core educational requirements today?
La question s'adresse à qui? À monsieur.
Who is this question for? It's to both of you.
Vas-y, Marjolaine.
Ben,
Go ahead, Marjolaine. Well, each nation has a specific rate of speakers, a number of speakers, so it's different for each community. We can't talk about the vitality of a language. There are 9 Innu communities in Quebec. 2 of these Innu communities are in Labrador, and I would say that some communities are very far from the large centers, and in that context, they maintain their language at a rate of which varies between 70% and 80% of people who are speaking it. There are communities where they don't speak where there's only 30%, but generally speaking, I would say if there were to, as an average, I would say it would be roughly 70%. That is an approximate portrait of the situation. But what's important to know is that for a language, the danger is that a language can disappear. And that can happen over 1, 2, and 3 generations. That's all it takes for a language to disappear.
In council point of view, of the 8 nations we represent, 6 are still have fluent speakers in our schools, and we do have immersion up to grade 2. for the majority of our schools. Of the two communities or the two nations that have lost a language, one of them we're starting to see in our elementary schools. And when the kids play outside, some of them are now starting to speak in Wendat among themselves. So that means that the revitalization process that is ongoing and the investments made by our teachers, by the Heritage Canada language program, and by our own decision to safeguard our languages are working out.
That's very helpful. Madame de Chernish, est-ce que les...
Madame de Chernish, have the Innu in the north of Quebec asked the provincial government to have their ballots in Indigenous language for their provincial elections? Can you repeat your... I didn't understand the word ballot. Oh, okay. So, did you ask to be able to vote in your language for the provincial elections in Quebec? We didn't make any specific request to the government, but what's interesting when it's you who are making initiatives at the federal level, our organization, our band council, we work locally to promote the use of the language within the community so that we'll be able to use the language. The community has to transmit it. They have to use the language. The mothers and fathers have to speak their children with that language. And so we encourage them to continue. And so we have a huge amount of work that needs to be done internally. And so governments such as the provincial Quebec government, they also can give us support in terms of promoting and giving value to the language.
Thank you for that exchange. Just because we are going a little bit longer, I would not be surprised if we only have one round of questioning. So I was generous there, and I will do the same with Ms. O'Connell. Over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And all my questions are through you. And the first is actually to both witnesses through the chair. Both actually of you spoke about the Mr. Gros-Louis, you spoke about the 11 languages in Quebec and the different dialects. We also heard witnesses from, I believe, Northwest Territories that also, I think, had 11 various Indigenous languages. And in Northwest Territories, some of the things we heard was that they were able to provide in provincial or municipal elections, as one example, the language of that particular, let's say, community or riding, as we would know it, or voter district. But from an Elections Canada perspective, that nimbleness in terms of by riding, ballot printing, and language translation, I think we can see there are some challenges there with the timelines. And to Ms. To Chernish, you also mentioned all nations must be respected, and I wrote that down because I guess if we are able to move forward and there are multiple Indigenous languages with multiple dialects, some using Slavics and some, if it's translated, how do we best respect all nations and languages given the amount of languages, number one, to make sure that they're reflective in the communities that I think both have talked about, ensuring that those in those communities can actually or are actually using them. So how can we best respect those language rights, or how do we best choose which languages are most commonly used in various parts of this country? So big, long question there, but I'll leave it open to both of you if you have some advice and guidance for us.
Jolene?
OK. Mais je parlais pour...
I will speak for the Nuimun. We have developed a corpus. We've standardized the written language and the oral language. There are 3 dialects. For the written language, it has been standardized, and at a certain point in time, we could find we write with a respected alphabet, and on the North Shore, there are some writings where Innu wouldn't be written in 3 dialects, but with 1 dialect, but some words might be written in 3 dialects. But it could also, the idea for the voter card that is sent out, or the Elections Canada card, you could have subtitles. You could also have the words welcome in the voting offices. So certain elements could be translated into the First Nations languages.
Ms. O'Connell, that if it's the intent of Parliament to provide guidance to Elections Canada to do that, first and foremost, Elections Canada doesn't have the expertise nor the capacity to do that. It's a simple fact of reaching out to our communities, and they will tell you who wants to have it done in their language, and we'll do the translation. As I said, the Atikamekw Nation was one of the nation member of the First Nation Education Council, has done it. So the process to go through the day, to be prepared and interested in the elections is already done. So you know that eventually there will be an elections. So therefore you can start working on it right away. You don't need to wait for that. So being proactive is a gesture of reconciliation. And in the previous panel, there was a question about picture. We do work with picture. A lot of our languages are visual and cannot be translated because of all the stories that are behind it. And it would create a sense of respect by having more visual in how the guidelines and preparation. As you see, we have lots of picture with the Atikamekw communities that have been used. So therefore that can be started right away. You don't need to wait for calling of the election and the writ to drop to do that. In September 2018, the Canadian Review on Political Science, there were 3 researchers, Dabin, Daou, and Pepillon. I guess Daou is the previous speaker, but it says clearly that the higher voter turnouts in Indigenous communities corresponds with a higher proportion of Indigenous candidates. We saw what happened in Kenora at the last election. 3 flying communities didn't get their ballots on time, and it was a First Nation candidate that could have had a shot for being voted in. So stuff like that, as I said, being proactive, and we'll do translation for you, no problem.
Perfect,
that would be an engagement.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't mean to, it's really hard. I don't mean to cut you off, but Madam Chair, how much time do I have? Can I pass it to my colleague, Ms. Raminato?
Yes, really quickly.
Oh, sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses for their testimony. I have a quick question. Mr. Gros-Louis, you showed a document earlier. I'm not sure if it's possible for you to send that document to the clerk so that the clerk can share it with the members of this committee. I have asked several times of the witnesses that if whether the Commissioner of Elections Canada has communicated directly with partners to see if they have the documents that exist that are already translated, to be able to see if they can be used, such as a sign that says "Vote here" in the local language. And it would seem that they don't have that. So I do appreciate your testimony to say that we're ready to work with anybody so that we can have accessibility for the Indigenous vote. Thank you very much. Madam Member, this is the document that I was showed. It was an Election Canada's a document. It was translated with the collaboration of the Atikamekw Nation, so I'll be very pleased to send that to that Election Canada document to the clerk. That would be great. Thank you very much for that exchange. And now, Madame Gaudreau, you have 6 minutes. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm very pleased to hear you this morning, Madam Chair. Right away, we've just seen an important moment in our meetings. That is that there are already many tools that are available. And through our meetings, and this is why we're having these meetings, that we came to know that there were already 16 documents translated into different languages. And I hope that the meeting today will allow, at least for us to see that, for us Quebecers at least, that we do wish to be able to build and to be able to continue to have dialogue with you. I think that there are 3 Atikamekw communities and Mohawk communities in my riding, so I think that there's going to be a future cultural center which is also going to be able to help demystify and to be, for people to have knowledge of the Indigenous cultures. So I have a question for you. The first, you talked about the youth organization. I think Mr. Groslo and Mr. Volant, who were saying that, well, yes, there is training, and but there's also, Madam Chair, and this is what I'd like to hear. I'd like to know this first step. Is that going to be very determining? Because what we're heard that we have to invest more so that each community would be able to reappropriate their language and relearn their language and their culture. Madam Chair, I'd like to hear what both witnesses have to say. Mr. Groslo, well, yes, thank you. The work in terms of an educational agreement between the federal government and the 22 members of the First Nations Council. This is almost finished. It was today, just before we started here. So this is a progress, a major important gesture of reconciliation. So you have a scoop there. And this is, in terms of the approach to education, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to catch up, so that the Indigenous peoples have the same tools as the provincial education system has. But so I think that not only we have we have included language and culture, Indigenous language and culture. Mr. Groslo, I think I need to stop you because we've opened a huge door here with respect to what happens in Quebec. I have another question that I really need to ask you, which has more to do with the federal government. So, Madame Czernyshk, if you could, if I could get an answer from you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Your question had to do with language, or was it broader with respect to inclusion? Yes, exactly, inclusion. Do you feel that it is something that really is going to go through the ballots, or is it something where we deal with aid directly to the community and to the culture? I think it's through gestures such as what we're seeing right now that will become something that shows us that we're included. What's important is to be included. and that we be consulted, that we be respected, that who we are is respected, and also how we do things, so that be respected, that we have a different way of going about things. It can be seen in the workplace, it can be seen in our values, it can be seen in the way we think, and so it's important that we feel respected and that we are given respect. And so, of course, there's always the word decolonization, which is important. And so for decolonization, we do need to have an important reflection as to who we were before having participated in your institutions, in the way you work with administrations, how we worked before. Madam Chairman, and Madam Chair, if I could have just a few minutes. With respect to what involves the federal government, I'd like to have your idea when we talk about openness, when we talk about respect and understanding. You have 45 seconds. What do you think about the Indian Act? Can you be very frank and give us your opinion? Madam Chair, I would like to start with Madam Chernish. Well, from my point of view, personally, the Indian Act, it's not just the Indian Act, but it's everything that flows from that. All of the systems, the band councils. It's the relationship with the federal government that the way of working has been imposed upon us. That the way of naming our representatives, the way everything, the way we have to manage programs and the services, accountability, everything is done backwards. And power issues. Everybody needs to be included. We feel as though things have been imposed upon us, and it really doesn't we don't recognize ourselves in this, and I think that we're going to be losing out as time goes on. I'm so sorry, but Mr. Gros-Louis, if you could just give us a very short answer. I think that the government machine has different tools that can help improve reconciliation, to be able to build trust and to help the communities to develop despite the act. So what we want is concrete action. We see that the Indigenous Languages Act in Bill 92 has allowed us and our communities to be able to save our languages and to revitalize them. So this is important. As to tools, I think that every tool that is available, I think that we need to reverse the problems. How can we help the communities revitalize their language and to work with translations of the guide to be able to rebuild this confidence? Because yes, the legislation doesn't create a climate of trust, and the Crown has to maintain this trust. Thank you very much. We are doing this study, but with this, the Indian Act isn't really within our mandate, but we allowed this discussion because it's important to the subject. Madame Idlac, 6 minutes to you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. First of all, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing and ask through the chair to respond. The first question that I have the impacts of colonialism, the depths of the impacts of the colonialism, has it affected voter turnout? If both of you can respond to my question, thank you.
Oui, j'attendais que Denis.
I was waiting for Denis. I'm sorry I didn't get the translation. What I would like to, if you could translate the member's question. I don't know if it's a logistic problem, but I did not hear the French translation. I'm sorry for the question.
If I could get a translated translation of your questions, I will certainly answer in writing. And Kurmik for asking your questions to us.
So I will just put, this is part of our learning and
je peux répondre?
working. Oui, je vais vous donner un moment.
Can I answer? Yes, I will give you a moment.
We'll get the translation from Tuk, but we did not receive it in French. So just want to note that for the record. And Mr. Gros-Louis will make sure you do get that information so that we can get answers. But yes, over to you, Ms. Chernish.
Oui.
Well, I think it was years after Confederation before registers Indians and others obtained the writing vote, the right to vote. And today, for the First Nations, it's not just a question of voting. There's also a question of local policies and all levels of government, provincial and federal. We were excluded for many years, and we were not allowed to have our own policies, our own administration, and probably exclusion. The exclusion that we experienced meant that we didn't feel as though we mattered. We weren't included in decisions. We weren't included in the elaboration of policies. So, of course, that had an impact on the level of participation. That is how I interpret it personally.
Thank you for your response. I would like to hear from both of you in terms of my next question in the importance of
Louis, est-ce que vous pouvez entendre la question?
Louis, are you able to hear the question now?
On the English channel, so I can hear. I figured that out.
Je sais que dans la salle, on peut entendre en français.
In the room here, we can hear in French. Are you hearing it, Madame, in French? So it's a technical issue.
Madame Idlout, à vous. Je ne vais pas couper ce.
the importance of reconciliation, is it not time to turn empathy into action?
Absolutely, Ms. Idlout. As I said earlier, there has been a concrete gesture of reconciliation in the last couple of months and years, probably, and we're going to witness that today with the federal budget, with all the rumors that Indigenous Services Canada's department will become the wealthiest department. But my point is not so much about money; it's about changing culture of behaviors. You had representatives of the Election Canada saying it's expensive to translate. It's not expensive It's the price of freedom. It's the price of working together. It's the price of collaborating together and growing together on our lands. And I would say that the gestures are more important than the money. And having, from Elections Canada point of view, reaching out to our communities, developing documents like the one I keep showing off, will be if all departments, not only Indigenous Services Canada, because some of their old school public servants are still reluctant to understand that they're working for enabling our communities to grow. They're still in the old fashion of trying to protect the crown. And every time they do that, they lose in court. So that's why I'm hopeful that the education agreement for Quebec will be such a positive move forward.
Madame Marjolaine, est-ce que vous avez...
Madame Marjolaine? Yes, for reconciliation, it's important for the communities that are close to their neighboring communities. We've experienced exclusion, racism, the occupation of the territory without not knowing each other, without sharing. So reconciliation is for everyone. It can be done in the interest of all of the people that are on the territory. And we need to consider the relations that we have towards the city, towards the cities and province, to the provinces, and to the country as a whole, to Canada. And so all of this is reconciliation. And also to ask forgiveness and to forgive and to continue to develop, but hand in hand together, and to consider everyone, that everybody taken into consideration, that we respect the differences between us.
Your time today. I have to say it's probably one of the best gifts anybody can receive. And on behalf of PROC committee members, I would like to thank both of you for sharing with us. Please do not hesitate to provide us anything additional in writing, including the Elections Canada document that we would like to have as part of the items that we will reference as we draft our report. So with that, I hope you both keep well and safe, and we look forward to continuing this work together. For PROC committee members, I would just like to put two things on the record. The first will be on March 31st, we were not able to have an Iqtutuk translation for this study. I would like to notify all committee members that the Translation Bureau has sent us an official letter of apology and is working to ensure that there are better resources to ensure that we can actually have adequate resources when it comes to ensuring that translation is available. So I wanted to make sure that we put that on the record, that they instantly followed up with it. They've taken it very seriously, and we will continue to push to ensure that the resources are also there. So I'd like to thank everyone for the way we were able to handle that and move forward. Secondly, subcommittee members received an email in regards to how we can move forward when we return back from the 2 constituency weeks. So I have asked that when we return on the 26th, we will continue with the code report, and I'm not going to say we'll complete it, but we're going to try. And on the Tuesday, on the Thursday, April 28th, we would actually be starting both the intent of the motion from Mrs. Block as well as the committee had agreed, the intent of the motion from Mr. Turnbull. And I am asking that we have a list of witnesses for Mr. Turnbull's motion by April 14th. So we've laid out a way, I think, that we can all work together to make it work, and I think I want to just thank everyone for that. We're not in camera, so we can't really get into the details of it, but please do share it with your members. Madame Goudreau, did you want to say something quick?
Oui, Madame la... Yes, Madam Chair. I just wanted to ask what time frame to be able to how much time do we have? You have till the 14th of April to be able to propose witnesses, and we'll receive it as of the 12th.
Good with that agenda? Perfect. Thank you. I hope everyone keeps well and safe. Happy April. See you at the end of this month. Take care.